I am Aimee Falchuk, for those of you I've not met before. Some of you have been to some of my lectures and others haven't. And what I like to do is I try to just take a direct interpretation of the lecture, but I also try to make it a little bit more accessible to sort of everyday life. So this is both the interpretation of it as directly as I can give it, and also sort of my sort of sense of the lecture and how it can be relevant to our lives. So what I did for tonight's lecture is we are doing this lecture, but I added some stuff from another lecture, 157, into this. And it's called Dependency as a Hindrance to Our Infinite Possibilities. All right, so the topic of this lecture is really about pleasure and what blocks our pleasure. And the Pathwork defines pleasure actually as the natural flow of our energy. Like it's not, I have a car, or I have a lot of money, or I have a relationship, or I have, not that those things can't be wonderful, but it really defines pleasure as the natural flow of our energy, of our life force. And that when we're in a natural flow, we're in pleasure. And so to deny ourselves pleasure is actually to deny ourselves life. So when we block our pleasure, we block our life force. And when we block our life force, we're saying no to life. We're resisting life. So pleasure is life, essentially. And the lecture really offers us a question of like, why would anyone block that? Like, why would we block our life force? So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to sort of identify through this marker that doesn't work. I had to give my license away for this. They don't work. Pleasure is elusive. Okay. Oh, shit. Okay. Pleasure. So again, pleasure is defined as the natural flow of our life force. Okay. I personally define it as the felt experience of consciousness. Some might describe it as their creativity. Some might describe it as their intuition. Some might describe it as like a full body experience. So each of you can identify for yourself what pleasure means to you. For me, again, I sort of buy into this idea of the natural flow of my life force and the felt experience of consciousness. When I have a sense of something like really deep inside me and there's an awareness of it, like I find pleasure in that. So as we're going through this lecture, I really encourage you to think of like, does anyone want to just say off the bat, like when someone says, what does pleasure mean? What might someone say?
It means like a state of flow.
A state of flow, okay. Anyone else?
Enjoyable sensation.
Enjoyable sensation. So flow, sensation. Ah. Anything else?
There's some kind of integrity between my inside and my outside.
Integrity.
What's outside is what's matching what's on inside.
Okay.
Alignment.
Alignment. Anyone else?
Joy.
Joy. So as we go through the lecture, just continue to think through, like, when do I feel pleasure? And then when do I not feel pleasure, and what's happening, right? Because what we're going to move to now is the question of, why do we block it? And often we don't do it consciously, but there are ways that we do that we don't even realize its effect is having on our pleasure, right? So why would someone block sensation, alignment between inner and outer, joy, flow, sensation, consciousness? Why would we block that? So the lecture really is going to focus in on what those things are. And I'm going to give you a list that this lecture and that other lecture offers to start thinking about the ways in which we block our pleasure. And remember, going back to this very specific point, that to deny ourselves pleasure is to deny ourselves life. Because one of the things the lecture says is that one of the reasons why we deny pleasure is because we think it's indulgent or selfish. Or if we're on a spiritual path, then we have to sacrifice our pleasure. Because to be in a spiritual life means we don't have pleasure. Like there's all these weird distortions about pleasure that allow us to start denying it and depriving ourselves from it. And then all we do, as the lecture says, is we actually act out. So things like drugging and drinking and sex and all these things that we're doing, not in their natural state, but things that we do in an addictive quality is actually sort of what we believe it's the only way we can have our pleasure without sort of really owning that we can have it without destroying ourselves, without sort of being destructive in our relationships. So we're going to discover a little bit about that. Before we start, anyone have any questions so far? No. Okay. So one of the first reasons why we block our pleasure is that we are very much attached to our ego self. And our ego self is, as the guide describes it, is our thinking mind and our volitional will. So it's the thing that when we get up in the morning and we brush our teeth and we get up in the morning and we think what our day is going to be like and what we want to do and who we want to be with and how we want to do, that's all the outer will, right? And we identify ourselves with that part of us, right? What's the first thing you say when you meet someone?
How are you?
No, really? That's not the answer. It's not the answer I was looking for.
I am so.
I am, right, thank you. Yeah, I am, right? You immediately identify yourself as this self that you have been appointed as at birth, right? I am Aimee, I am Ken, I am Carrie, right? So we identify ourselves by this kind of ego presentation of who we are. And we're very much attached to that. And we're told in life to attach ourselves to that. So our volitional thinking mind and our volitional will does all sorts of things in the world. It goes to the right schools, it looks the right way, it acts the right part, it does what it needs to do. It's constantly churning out whatever the expectation is of that society, that system, that family. So that outer faculty is, that outer will is really wonderful, right? But it's in service of the ego and the ego only. It's in service of the identity. It's in service of the part of us that says, if I'm not Aimee, then I'm nothing. So I got to make sure I'm Aimee and make sure I'm the good Aimee and the smart Aimee and that whatever Aimee fits in there, right? That's where I spend all my time. So pleasure can't really be experienced when you're attached to the ego self. Because the ego self is sort of that one part of us that is out in the world. But as Ken said, there's an alignment between the inner and the outer. If we don't have access to that inner wisdom, that inner knowledge, intelligence in us, we can't actually feel our flow and our pleasure. So long as we're solely attached to the ego and what the ego does and our identity, we can't feel our pleasure. We can probably have success and maybe we get accolades from the outside and maybe we're adored or admired and maybe people talk about us or write about us or whatever it might be. But you're only presenting to the world and yourself a piece of yourself. So that's one way our pleasure gets blocked, is our attachment to the ego self. Does that make sense? Yeah? Yeah.
What if you enjoy the accolades you get from your ego self?
Yeah, so there's nothing wrong with, and the lecture says this, that the key is not to push the ego aside. The ego is so necessary. But the ego not in service of the inner kind of self is really going to be only attached to that adoration. Because what happens when that adoration goes away? Then it's like, oh, now I'm nobody. Now nobody likes me. Right? So we become so attached to that. So there's nothing wrong with the ego. It's what it's in service of. Right? If it's in service of awakening that inner self that is kind of our spirit, that's one thing. If it's only in service of meeting the needs of outside expectations, then it's a rat race. So it's enjoyable in that moment, but then it's like, well, what's your next accomplishment? Yeah, it's not sustainable. And it is oftentimes what finally brings us into crisis, is we're so trying to meet the needs of our ego self and maintain our identity, stay young, stay pretty, stay smart, stay relevant, we're all trying to stay, that at one point we crash. So there's nothing pleasurable in that whole experience, right? So attachment to the outer ego is one way that we block pleasure. Okay? The second is our belief system. about pleasure. So what's a belief that someone here holds about pleasure, or what's something they were told growing up about pleasure?
As a Catholic, you're really not supposed to have it.
You're not supposed to have it. Because?
Consider
Because
sinful.
it's a sin.
It's a sin. Pleasure is a sin.
It's dangerous and selfish.
It's dangerous and
It's a
selfish.
zero-sum game. If I'm
Uh-huh.
having pleasure, somebody else is having pleasure.
Okay.
I'm only valuable if I'm working hard.
I'm only valuable if I'm working hard. So that if you were having pleasure, that would mean you're not useful. You're not being useful.
Not worthwhile, and you have to suffer to be worthy.
Right.
You have to suffer to be worthy.
Yeah, you have to earn it.
You have to earn it.
Yeah.
You're a bad person if you have pleasure.
You're a bad person. You have, because?
Because we don't do it in our family.
Uh-huh. Yep. Okay.
We don't have pleasure.
You don't have pleasure. Okay. Anyone else?
It could make a person not able to be responsible.
Responsible, right. So you either have to choose, the pleasure principle or the reality principle, which one of the lectures says. Pleasure principle is I can have pleasure. The reality is you deny pleasure for the sake of whatever you need to do. Be responsible, get things done, be worthy, be valuable, all that stuff, right? Right. So that's a false choice. This idea that we either have to be responsible or have pleasure. Like that idea that that one has to exclude the other. That's a false choice that we're given in our culture. Right?
And related to that pleasure could make a person lose control.
Uh-huh.
Related to being responsible.
Yes. Right, and the lecture talks about this again as it relates to addiction. That when pleasure gets out of control, it's usually not pleasure. It's actually sort of the ego that's so tightly held wants out so bad that the only way it can liberate itself is by getting highly intoxicated or by doing something that really just rips them from them. And then it becomes really bad, something bad happens, and they're like, see, I told you I can't be myself. And it's this vicious circle. So this idea of pleasure being kind of leading us to indulgence is really it's a false pleasure. It's not real pleasure. It's something else. It's acting out.
But some forms of pleasure are not frowned upon in society, like sexual pleasure.
Uh-huh.
Specifically, there are specific taboos about how
Yes.
sexual pleasure should happen.
Yes, absolutely.
That's how I feel.
Right. So, our conditioning tells us, our family, our church, our culture tells us what is good pleasure and what is bad pleasure, as if sort of that exists. Right? And what the guide is naming is that it's not so much good or bad pleasure, it's like real pleasure versus acting out. But what you're saying is something different, where there's an actual judgment coming from
Yeah.
your culture. Right. Absolutely. Which lends to a belief system. It's bad.
Mhm. Right?
So another belief system about pleasure might be, if I let my energy flow, I will be annihilated. I remember growing up, and my mom would say, we're happy, not that happy, and I would be like, what? Why are we not that happy? And she was like, because if you say you're that happy, then, whoever she imagined up in the sky making all the rules was like, they're going to take it from you. And so I started to develop this fear of if I really let myself be happy, I'm going to be struck down.
Like people consider immoral to have pleasure.
It's immoral to have pleasure, right?
To
And
be too happy is immoral for a lot of people.
right, because
Belief system.
belief system, right. Right. So there are indoctrinated beliefs that we have about pleasure, and then there's experiences we have in childhood that really make us wonder whether pleasure is safe. Right? So again, with my experience with my mom, it's I felt in her fear as it related to pleasure, because she was saying it has to be contained or else something's going to happen. And so she wasn't really saying it was bad, but she said something that made me scared of pleasure a little bit. So I developed a little bit of a more almost like an OCD around pleasure, which is I can have it, but not that much, because if it goes here, it'll be taken. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that gets embedded in us around allowing our pleasure.
I was just gonna say, when, I'm a therapist, and when my client, has had a tragedy or a trauma or something, I mean, maybe this is obvious, but when you talk about pleasure, they're so closed and
Yes.
tight because they're afraid of,
Yes.
they know what it feels like when the shoe drops.
Yes.
So they don't, they're afraid to let themselves have pleasure.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, when we do more the body-oriented work and we're sort of working with pleasure, the body literally won't allow pleasure in. So there's a contraction of the energy and of the musculature and of the breath that, if pleasure is the natural flow of energy, then a contorted body to protect itself is not going to allow for flow. So it's not, we can't really get to their pleasure by talking about it. We have to sort of open up the places where the energy can flow. And especially when you're dealing with trauma, Yeah. Oh, sorry.
For me, when there's a kind of a secondary tangential fear that I know how much I love pleasure and I'm afraid of the pain of when it goes away.
The loss.
Like if I let myself really have it, then I've got something to lose,
Right.
and that's just so completely painful. And I'll stay out of the whole game.
Right. Great. Yes.
So far,
Yep. You and, yeah, sorry.
It was basically that, but she said something about the shoe.
Uh-huh.
So the guide does talk about that, right? That there is no other shoe?
To drop.
No.
Yes, I mean, I think its overarching message is that that's dualistic consciousness, right? That the other shoe's going to drop, right? Because things are either really good or they're not, or it's like they're going well or they're not. It's good or it's bad, and the idea is that it's all of it, right? So even if the other shoe drops, meaning that like life kind of goes like this and then it kind of goes like this, that's all part of it. Versus, and we'll get to this in a second around negative motivation, versus being so afraid that shoe's going to drop that you stay out of the game altogether,
Right.
which is kind of what Ken's talking about also. Yeah,
So we're all saying the same
yeah,
thing. So expanding consciousness so that the negative actually is a version of the positive.
the negative would be what? What are you describing the negative
I'm
as?
saying, all right, if I hit traffic and that was a bad thing, then
Right.
it turns out that it was a good thing.
Right.
Because I met somebody in the process of being stuck in traffic.
Right. Yeah, I think.
So-
Yeah, I think what you're saying is just that, what we place value on, or sort of how we judge a situation, is, we can sort of make something into good and bad by sort of how we interpret it, versus sort of, I'm in traffic, I don't like that, then I met someone and then this happened and it opened up something, and you can tell a very different narrative. So I think what you're saying is sort of how we perceive and then interpret.
So that's number 2 there.
Yeah, number 2 is just to the guide says we really need to explore again what our beliefs. So, if it's pleasure is sinful, or if I have pleasure, it's going to be taken from me, or if I have pleasure, the other shoe's going to drop, or I'll be annihilated if my energy flows, or it's selfish to be happy, or I'm a spiritual person, I have to sacrifice happiness for my spiritual life. These are all things we just tell ourselves to avoid pleasure. Some, again, we think are true because we've been taught to believe it's true. It's not like we're fooling ourselves, but we are fooling ourselves. And so the work is to sort of out our belief system about pleasure.
I wonder if it actually connects to being loved conditionally. Like your mother didn't love you unconditionally, saying, "Oh, what a beautiful girl! She's got all this fun. What a pleasure to watch her, right?" But she loved you conditionally. She loved you when you were just so. And I feel like my belief system also was from being loved very conditionally. I was only approved of and loved when I was perfect, successful, healthy, this, that, and the other. But as soon as I wasn't loved.
Yes, and so we're going to get to that when we talk about dependency, because dependency blocks our pleasure because the child in us is waiting for the parent or the parent substitute to give us permission to have our pleasure. And so we're making all sorts of adjustments to make sure that they're going to say, yes, we can have pleasure, right? That's a hard position to be in when we're adults and we're not children anymore, waiting and adjusting and adapting. right? Because of that message that was love is conditional and you've got to be all these things. So dependency on other people on that emotional level is a way that we block pleasure. So I think that's what you're naming.
I don't know if it's just on other people, it can be circumstances.
Okay.
You know, like I love myself as long as I'm successful, I have a great job. Right now I'm in between jobs. I hate it.
Right.
And it's very hard for me to have pleasure because I'm waiting for the job to come over, then I can have pleasure.
Right. Right.
Because I'm approved of when I'm working and productive and
Right.
successful and making
So
money.
this goes back up to the attachment to the ego, right? It's like your identity is so tied to your happiness that when your identity is in flux in terms of what is my job, then you feel like I can't have pleasure until this happens, right? If pleasure is just the natural flow of our energy, you can have it anytime. Anytime,
Right.
right?
And
So-
I do, but it's being blocked more so in those
Right,
states.
as it's tied to this, right? It's like, it's an affliction of all of us that we're so tied to the identity, and we're so tied to maintaining our identity because we think without it, we're nothing, that we can't be bothered with pleasure. It's like, I'm too busy trying to maintain something that's gonna die anyway, so I can't have pleasure. It's like,
But actually, it could be a very pleasurable state. It doesn't
right, and
have
that's what Alison was saying too, is like there is joy and pleasure in our hard work and our success and the things we do well in.
No, I'm saying I'm actually taking pleasure out of not working.
Oh, good.
Because I'm opening up to other options.
Uh-huh.
I'm more, open to not just being this.
Yes.
Being
Wonderful.
everything else, going everywhere else, learning all other things and experiencing myself and doing stuff I would never have been able to do if I was working.
Great. Great.
So in a
I'm
way,
glad to hear that.
it's freeing.
Yes. Yes.
It's like a lot has to do with the attitude, how do you approach it?
Yes.
Approach the situation with what attitude?
Yes.
Yeah, how you approach it.
Yes.
And then
Yes. And that's actually the third piece, which is called negative motivation, which blocks our pleasure. So the idea of negative motivation comes from this idea of magnetic fields, right? So there's positive magnetic fields and negative magnetic fields, and they're made up of our energy. So positive thinking, believing in ourselves, allowing our feelings to happen, believing in possibilities, trusting, surrendering, those all generate sort of a nucleus of energy that creates positive experiences, right? Negative ones more are born out of fear, deprivation, insatiability, oh, it's never going to happen, I'm not good at this. There's a lot of negativity in it, right? And that creates a self-perpetuating negative state, right? So what negative motivation is identified in the lecture is that we spend more of our energy avoiding a negative possibility than going and creating a positive one, right? Or facing something. And the best example I've read in this is literally like death, right? If we could learn to accept death, right, or face it, I mean, we don't have to accept it, but face it, like learn to be with it, and death meaning death, physical death, and just daily death. If we had a different relationship with it, we wouldn't have to spend all our energy staving it off. Think of all the ways you stave off death on a daily basis, whether it's physical death, emotional death, humiliation, endings, right? So all our energy, there's no pleasure in fighting, I mean, there's some pleasure in it maybe, but there's no pleasure fighting off a negative possibility.
Negative certainty.
Certainty, and it's not even negative, but a certainty, right? So it's like our energy, instead of in flow, it's all directed towards staving off something. So it's all this no energy, like I won't age, I won't get wrinkles, I won't, die, I won't, lose this relationship, I won't, and that's where, when you're going towards a won't, or you're going towards something to stave off something from not happening, when we want something more because we're afraid of not having it than actually having it, we're not in pleasure. We're in like something else. I was going to swear. But then I realized it's being filmed. Yeah. Does that make sense, negative motivation? Can you see in yourself where you spend more time trying to make sure something doesn't happen than going towards something that you would like to have happen? It's exhausting. Do you feel pleasure in it? I mean,
I'm afraid all the time.
You're afraid all the time. Right. And energetically, when we're in fear, our energy is not able to be in flow because usually what's, for you, if you're in fear, what does your body look like?
In fear, I'm agitated. I'm like overcharged.
You're overcharged.
Discharge, and I usually do like aggressive.
Yeah. Okay.
Stuff.
And you went, right. Okay. Anyone
There's
else?
like tightening.
Tight.
You shrink. You
Right.
Know, so it's a fear reaction. You
Right.
Shrink.
So if I'm like this, how much pleasure am I in?
I'm not,
It's flowing. Can't you feel it? Sometimes like they look like an apple.
Positive
but-
is just more like expanding.
Right.
It's like letting loose.
Right.
Just be, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like the thing about, and this goes to your, I think your point of, or someone's point about pleasure. It's like there's like so if we're really tight, if our energy is like I got to be perfect, I got to be this, our energy is going to be so, it could get to the point where we're completely compulsive, where we're rigid and we can't move, right? Or on the other end, we completely have so little sort of containment that we're all over the place.
Right.
We're completely like, you can't ground us, we can't. Neither one of these.
You end up where you don't want to be. When, you know what I mean? You
Yes.
end up having control, but then by acting like this, and you end up like being
Yes.
totally out of control.
Right, so both of these states are not pleasurable states.
Yeah.
The task is to move into the center place where we allow for spontaneity and pleasure, but we also have control,
Yeah.
right? And that's real pleasure. This is like addiction and acting out, you know?
Destructive.
Yeah, and this is probably like just weirdos like me. Like, you know, I have to be on time. I have to, you know, I shouldn't write that.
Rigidity.
Rigidity, you know? It's like, it's not fun. There's no movement, right? So, you know, the idea is that pleasure lives here, you know? And that, you know, and there's enough ego strength, going back to why the ego is so important. The ego's strong enough to be able to let go a little bit to have this, but strong enough to still maintain some control. So that's really like the work we do in core is really this, you know? Just someone comes in and they're usually somewhere here, or maybe they're somewhere here, and it's like we want to move them to that center space where they're strong enough to actually feel their energy flow.
Is there some, it feels to me like there's some kind of authenticity in the middle, like that like authentic impulse versus having impulses that are attached to nothing or so attached
Yes.
to something. So there's some kind of authenticity in
Yes,
the middle?
because in some ways the compulsion is tied to fear, right? And in a lot of ways the impulsivity may be tied to a sort of, not a protest, but I mean, one, there's probably some ungroundedness, there's a weakness of ego, but they can't contain their energy, they can't hold, right? So neither one of these are true, is someone's true self. So yes, I think there is an authenticity here because there's a healthy balance between the internal and external.
I think about it like when I'm cooking for my kids, and I think if someone hates to cook, but they feel like they should, or they're afraid that they'll look bad or be a bad mom, and they're cooking and they're huffing and they're tight in their kitchen and the kids are vibing it, it never goes well.
No.
You know, but if you're like, if you come from a place like I enjoy it and like it gives me pleasure, it's something I have control over, and I can like light a candle and maybe have a glass of wine and then really cooking, then that energy feels so much better
Yes.
when you're actually giving
Yes.
food because it's not out of fear.
Yes.
You know, of I'm not good enough. or
Yes,
something.
and I think it goes again back to this idea of the attachment to that outer ego, that identity. Because so long as you're coming from, I have to make a good meal because then people will like me, you know, versus I want to make a good meal because it's so pleasurable to have a good meal with people. And even if it's not a good meal, I can take pleasure in the exercise of doing it and wanting to support people, you know. And I think it's good to really watch where you move from pleasure to like resentment or feeling burdened. When I read the lectures alone in like coffee shops, I'm like the happiest person ever. I'm like, oh my God, it's so fun and it's pleasurable. And as soon as I decide I'm going to give a lecture, I'm like, I hate these lectures, I hate all these people, because now I have to show up, and I have to say it the right way, and I have to be perfect, and I don't know who's gonna come, and it's like, the pleasure's gone, because I've moved into this attachment to like, are they gonna like me?
Yeah, totally.
Right? And gone is that natural flow of my energy of just loving these lectures. So, I really encourage you to just be attentive to where you're like, oh, I'm really not in that pleasure state anymore, because that's the way to, and where am I spending all my time staving something off, versus being in it. If I'm pushing off death, what would it be like to actually just kind of face death instead and see if there's any pleasure in that? Yeah, it's not, yeah.
Sometimes say that that is a very pleasurable state.
They say it. I don't know. Yeah, the other side. But I will tell you this. When my father died in May, I made a decision. I was reading lecture 81, which is about conflict in the world of duality. And it was really about those who fear death, fear life. And when he passed away, I made a decision that I had been so afraid of death my whole life that I decided I was going to face death. I was just going to look at it. And horrible experience. But what I realized is so much of my energy, because I had so much fear of death, was here. I was doing so much to avoid any type of death, including a physical one, that I had such little pleasure as a result. And so it really went to what that lecture said, is those who know how to die know how to live. The more afraid we are of death, the more, whatever death means, the more we're going to be in this compulsion part. Or we're going to be over here being like, fuck it, it's death, it doesn't matter, I don't have to do anything.
Let's just do what we got to do.
Right, so it's like, again, that healthy balance is like life and death, they're all part of a continuum, and how can I be in the pleasure of that? So that's negative motivation. The fourth one is dependency, which my writing is, it's how it's going to be, so sorry. So this comes from a different lecture, but I thought it was really relevant to what we're talking about. And this is where, even though we're all adults in the room, this is where we still live in the child state. And the child, rightfully so, is dependent on the caregiver for pleasure. Whether that pleasure is food, whether that pleasure is being held, whether that pleasure is just, yes, you can go play with your friends. I mean, whatever age you're at, pleasure is sort of dependent on the parent permitting it to happen. So many of us are arrested in, there's some arrested development, and we're still in that child place where we're looking for someone to permit us, for us to be happy. I have a lot of clients who just want a relationship, because when they get in one, suddenly they're allowed to be happy. And I'm always like, your life was great right before you met this person, and now it's finally validated. What's happening, right? And they'll say like, well, finally this substitute, this parent substitute, this other person tells me that I can be happy and enjoy my life and accepts me, so now I can be happy. That's a really hard place to be in. You're at the mercy of another all the time. So we have to do the work to mature ourselves out of that child state, to recognize that the only person we are dependent on for our pleasure is us. Now that doesn't mean that we're not relational beings and we need other people. Nothing in the lecture says we don't need other people for pleasure. It's when we are dependent on another for pleasure that we get ourselves in trouble. Because think what we then have to do to get it. Right? Like you said, love was conditional. So if you're dependent on your parent or parent substitute for pleasure, and love is conditional, then you've got to figure out what all those conditions are and just spend all your energy making sure you are that.
Right. Yeah.
That's not your energy flowing. That's you working at it to get whatever it is that the person you've given all the power to needs and wants.
It's a total
What?
It seems like it ties back to negative motivation too. Like I'm trying to always push away their disapproval.
You're always trying to push away the
my
disapproval.
caregiver's disapproval.
Your caregivers,
So I'm always like, staying out of what's making them unhappy, what will make them disapprove, what
Right.
will make them,
Right.
So I'm in the negative motivation loop there too.
Yes, that would make sense. Because you're dependent.
Maybe that's just how it works for me.
Well, no, but if you're dependent on this other person, right, and you're afraid they're going to go away or take away your pleasure,
Mhm.
then you're going to be acting in ways to make sure that that doesn't happen. That is negative
Right,
motivation.
Right, exactly.
And the
Isn't
same
it
thing
intentional?
happens at work when you have, a job or responsibility that you don't thoroughly enjoy, and you have to play by the rules, so to
Mhm.
speak, to keep it.
Mm-hmm.
And so your misery comes from, I don't necessarily enjoy behaving certain way, but I have to fit in.
Uh-huh.
I want to keep it.
Yes.
So that's also a lot of dependency, on. It's very hard to be in a state of flow and really enjoy yourself and be happy when you're just not happy, either in the environment or just doing what you're doing.
Yep. And that, the guide would offer you, do you have to be where you are? Is there...
I'm not anywhere in particular right now, so
Right.
it's okay. But
Right.
I've been to jobs when I had a state of flow, and I've been to jobs when it was extremely unpleasant.
Right. Right.
And so it's a big difference, between the set of rules.
Yep. Yep.
We work with a lot of young adults, and I think part of the dependency piece is like the separation, individuation
Uh-huh.
from parents, and part of it is like when you go to your dependent and you say, promise me everything's gonna be okay, like nobody's gonna die and nothing,
Mhm.
and then the realization that they can't actually promise that to
Yes.
you. And how do you mature through that and
Yes.
face those things? Because you're used to growing up, if you have a nurturing parent,
Yes.
oh, it's okay, they'll be fine,
Yes.
and then to come to the realization and work through that, I
Yes.
think is part of working into your flow,
Absolutely.
which is really hard to do.
Absolutely. And really all of these, what's underneath all of these are feelings you're going to have to feel, right? It's like to your point, it's like to let go of the dependency, even though at the end of the day there's something great that comes from it, which is your individuation, that person has to actually go through the pain of the separation,
Totally.
right? And that's what's frightening, or for Ken, when you're talking about that, to have pleasure means you're going to lose pleasure, well, you're going to have to go through the process of really accepting loss as part of the game
Yes.
in order to really allow yourself pleasure.
Right.
So that's the sucky part of these lectures, is the path to sort of, the path to pleasure is really doing the actual hard work to uncover what the systems are, to uncover your motivations, and then to feel what's underneath it.
So that's the reasons we do all this. right?
That's the reason we do all that, right? It's negative motivation to avoid pain.
To avoid those
To avoid
feelings.
pain, right?
Yeah.
But in reality, we're doing it to avoid pleasure,
Yeah.
so that we don't have to feel the pain.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
it's all the
paradox.
same, right?
Also to go to that next level of being with whatever you want to call universal consciousness, God, or whatever, that is our destiny, is to always live in that.
Mm-hmm.
So surrendering is something else, because the ego is surrendering.
Yes.
So even though we're go through all this pain, it is through the pain to the ultimate pleasure.
Yes.
also.
Yes, and thank you for saying that, because that's the next one, which I I took from another lecture, is unitive versus dualistic consciousness, and how duality sort of blocks pleasure, because again, we're taught that if you have life and you have death, and they're seen as opposites, and one is deemed good and one is deemed bad, you're going to spend all your time making sure you ain't here,
Yeah.
right? Even if at the expense of not really being here. If you sort of understand the way the guide says that life and death is just, there's birth and life and death, and it's all sort of part of a continuum, a transition, you might have a very different relationship with life, right? So this idea of like the unit of consciousness, the idea that we don't have to try so hard to be our best selves because we are these separate beings. We're actually all sort of one in some way. It allows us to loosen the power of that outer ego, that identity, which goes to the lecture we did last time, if you were here. So unitive versus dualistic consciousness is another way in which we block our pleasure. When we're stuck in duality, pleasure becomes difficult, because again, we're always trying to make sure we're not in the category that seems bad.
Isn't there another duality of pain and pleasure too?
Yes?
I mean, so the mystics say that pain is pleasurable.
Yes.
Real, authentic,
Yes.
true pain.
Yes. But in our dualistic consciousness, which is what we live on in this
Right.
plane of consciousness, this is where we are.
Yeah.
So no, pain is bad. Pleasure also seems to be bad. Nothing's good. You know what I think we have? I'll tell you what I think we have compromised on that. I think we have compromised by admiration and being liked. I think we have found we can't deal with pleasure, we can't deal with pain, so we have figured out a way to get something that gives us some sense of joy during the day.
Right.
Someone recognizing us, someone seeing us, someone,
Sort of the toxic mimic,
the toxic mimic. I like that.
pleasure.
Pleasure. Right. The last one is a bit nuanced. It's our demands. We'll just start with our demands. So, I'm trying to think if this is a good example. Well, Trump wants a wall. Right?
You're in dangerous
I
territory.
know, but I'm not going to analyze it. I'm just saying. No, I'm giving this as an example about demand. Trump wants a wall, okay? The merits of it, the whatever of it, who cares, right? Trump wants a wall. Sorry, I saw something that was, he was on a Lego box and he was building a wall. And he was like a 4-year-old's body with his head on it and he was just building, it was just funny. But anyway, so Trump wants a wall. If Trump doesn't get the wall, he's taking his wall and going home, right? I mean, he's really, he's creating a lot of pain because he has a demand. And that demand is he wants the wall, right? So that's a stupid example for sort of when we make demands on ourselves and of life and other people, that it be a certain way, and anything short of that we won't accept, we are blocking our pleasure.
He doesn't seem like he's in pleasure.
I don't know what he's in, but I think it's, where we can often disguise our demands as our higher self. Like, I just really want this for this person. It's like, no, you don't. You want it. And you're acting like you care about this other person, but you want it, right? So we have to really look when we are in a demand about life and about what would make us happy and see where that blocks our pleasure. And why do you think a demand would block pleasure?
Because if we don't get it, you'll be very upset.
Okay.
You're forcing it.
You're forcing it? Forcing?
You're
Because
not
it's depending.
accepting what is.
You're not accepting what is?
You have a
Exactly.
judgment of what will happen if you don't get it.
Judgment about what will happen, right?
Yeah, it's dependency also. If I don't get it, then I'm not gonna be
Right,
happy or fulfilled.
Right.
You know.
right,
So it depends. If I get that result, then I'll be okay.
Right.
And it's a conditional situation.
right,
Yeah.
right.
It's very dualistic.
It's very dualistic, right,
I'm identified with whatever it is.
right. I am this,
So most people want certain amount of money, otherwise they can't have pleasure.
right, that's right, yep. So they have an idea of what that, having all that money would mean, and therefore they have to have it in order for them to have
Yeah.
pleasure, yep,
Less
Then you
money.
have wealthy people who are absolutely miserable.
yep.
I mean, the man is aggressive in nature. In the nature of itself, I feel it's aggressive.
Yes. Well, you have to have it, I have to have
Yeah.
it. I have to have this.
Yeah.
Do you want to give it to me?
That's aggressive.
When I say that to you, do you want to give it to me? I have to have it.
No.
It's
You're not
easy.
So not only am I not going to get what I want, but like I'm angry at you for not giving it to me. There's no pleasure. There's no connection.
I mean, there can be pleasure, but I feel that there can be pleasure, but there's no connection.
Yeah, it's a pseudo pleasure. It's the
Yeah.
pleasure of the lower self, where it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
you're going to give it to me.
Yeah.
You're going to give it. I can get excited about that, but I'm not in pleasure with you.
Not with me, but for yourself.
Yeah.
I can be in pleasure like that, but I'm not connected with it.
Yes.
I know that.
Correct.
I'm disconnected.
Right.
And
Correct.
in the long term, it just
Correct. Right. And something Marna says feels really important, which is, when we're making demands, we're not in acceptance of what is. And inherently, pleasure involves some level of acceptance of what is. You don't have to like it, but it's an allowing for what is. So our demands are a place where I think we have to look at as much as our belief system. Because we're making demands all the time. And we block our pleasure by doing that. Because what we're saying is it can only be this way. And so we're blocking out what could be over here, which is actually pleasurable.
Is that a violation of spiritual law demands?
Is that, I'm sorry?
There's a spiritual laws lecture,
Uh-huh.
and there are different examples of how we might be violating spiritual laws. So if it's a demand, it would be the law of brotherhood, where everybody gets what they want, not just one person.
I think demand would fall under a law like personal responsibility or
Well, I mean, it said that the two higher selves of two people can never be in conflict. So fundamentally, if a demand is seen as unreasonable or forcing, there's some level that people are not connecting with.
right. I was thinking about a demand when you have a demand within yourself and outside of the relationship piece, what's happening within yourself. There's something that if you're making a demand, there's something you're not taking responsibility of within yourself. Right?
I'm just not thinking that there's this idea that I know what pleasure is. Like there's a real, sort of misplaced or distorted thinking there that I actually know what will give me pleasure. And
Right.
I don't think I do,
Right.
actually. But I've said, I know what gives me pleasure and I want it.
Right.
So there's some
Right.
distortion in my inside in that way.
And the distortion of that, what's so important about the distortion of what you're saying is that pleasure is actually a felt experience in the moment.
Right.
So we're always outside of it being like, that would bring me pleasure. It's like, how do you, it's like, be in it, then define it as pleasure, right? We're all out here like, this would make me happy, this would bring me pleasure. It's like, how do you you
Right.
can't know it until you're in it.
And a demand isn't even in the moment.
No,
It's
the
not in
demand
moment
is,
at all.
the demand's outside of it, saying you have to give it to me so I can have pleasure. It's
Right,
like,
in the future.
yeah, but you can have pleasure right now by accepting what is.
Right.
And I'm dependent on you if I'm demanding from you.
Absolutely,
Then
it
I'm
goes back to,
dependency and it's just.
yeah, they call it in the lecture a vicious circle.
Isn't demand also maybe like a violation of someone else's right? I mean, right? If you
Yeah.
demanding that person, I mean, I think that's what to answer our question, that's more like the spiritual law is violated there. That you're forcing someone to give you what he or she doesn't want to give you.
Yes.
So you're violating that person's right.
Yes.
So that's a violation of the
Yes.
spiritual law right there, I would say.
Yes.
But
And
to the higher power, if you're demanding, right, to the higher power, you kind of sort of putting yourself above it, because you know better. You're not accepting
Yeah.
what's given you.
yeah, and I think in the exploration of demands, you're going to find fear, you're going to find self-will,
Yeah.
you're going to
Insecurity.
find insecurity, you're going to find sort of lack of faith, right? Because if you demand is forcing energy. So anytime we're forcing our energy, we're not in faith, we're in fear, right? Because it's like we're so sure we're not going to get it and we have to have it that we have to force our energy to get it. So energetically, it is a tight energy, a forcing energy. And anytime we're in a forcing energy, we're not in pleasure. That's why it goes to what Marna said about accepting of what is. There's an allowance, there's a certain flow in accepting of what is, even if we don't like it. Versus like, I won't accept the way it is, I'm going to get what I want. It's not that. It's not that flow. And I do think that really checking in with yourself energetically around pleasure is so important, because you will feel in your body where you're saying no to pleasure. Where the best place to see it, I think, is when you're eating a good meal and you're talking about the calories or, how much weight you're going to gain off a meal. It's like the pleasure meter goes down. If you're sitting with someone and they're like, oh my God, tomorrow I'm going to be so fat. It's like, okay, but I'll feel pleasure with it. But it's like to really notice where something has the potential or already is pleasurable. And because of all these belief systems we have, or if I have it, it's going to be taken away, or is my ego going to be, am I going to be seen in a strange way if I have my pleasure, or like what will mom say, or my husband say, or this say, and If I'm happy, then am I not? I mean, watch how all this stuff plays out in your body and in relationship to people and in your thought process. And notice what happens to your pleasure current.
It's a word that we haven't mentioned here that seems to me that plays a big role here, which is guilt also, because you create all this guilt.
The Catholic one brought it up.
Yeah.
That was the first thing she brought up. It's a sin.
Because then this guilt then it stops you from just like, oh, I don't know, I can't do it, I can't do it, because then I'll be guilty, I'll be punished or whatever.
Yes.
And so it plays a big role.
Yes, and I think what the lecture, I read somewhere the lecture says about guilt around pleasure is that's a really interesting cop-out. Like, to feel guilt about pleasure. If pleasure is life, right, and you feel guilty about if you pull that out, you feel guilty about living, then there's you can't just leave it at that. You have to look at, like, where did that belief come from? That to be alive, to be fully in the world, to be in my flow means I'm bad. And I have to feel bad about it.
It's totally a distortion.
It's a distortion. But it lives in us. And we act it out. Yeah.
What about shame? Where does shame come in?
Yeah, so I think I told this story last time. But I have a niece who is very open with her body. She loves to dance and move around. Her shoes never match. Her hair's all like, and she loves it. She's like in it. She loves it. And I see her parents containing her a little bit. Like, not so loud, not so much. Don't move around so much. Sit down, right? And you see a slow contortion of her energy because she still is dependent on her parent. She's young, right? And she needs them to love her and approve of her. So her pleasure current might be so big, but it's having a negative effect on the people that she's dependent on. So she's adjusting her energy, and through shame, she's being shamed in some way. She's being told you're too much. That is shameful, right? It feels it's a horrible feeling, and so you make sure that you hide it or you sort of contort it so you can't have access to it. So there's there's a lecture, Shame of the Higher Self, which is really about this. It's like, did you guys read it already?
She just got it tonight.
Oh.
That's the one I gave you.
Okay.
That was cool. But Shame of the Higher Self is all about that. It's like we often get shamed in our pleasure. That's why, think about like a little boy in a bathtub who starts touching himself and he's having pleasure and the mom comes in and she's like, oh my God, what are you doing? And the kid's like, I don't know what I'm doing, but it was fun, and like suddenly it's like that kid has just made some association that pleasure is bad, right? He got shamed in it. Right? Yeah, that's how an image is created. And all he was doing was a natural sort of experience of exploration and pleasure. So that happens all the time on such a subtle level, but it comes from, the grassroots of the family, it comes from the society, it comes from the church or the temple or the religion. It's coming at us from all ends, right? And so we're growing up and we keep getting these messages about, is that good pleasure? Can I have that? Is that indulgent? Am I okay? So shame absolutely is, and I think you'll enjoy that lecture, Shame of the Higher Self, because it's real about that.
I will. I don't know that I'll enjoy it, but I'll learn.
You might.
You'll have pleasure.
You'll have pleasure.
Just listening to you tell your story about your niece and listening to this discussion here, I'm really aware in my life about, it's always been this choice of my pleasure or your pleasure.
Uh-huh.
Like I've had to kill my pleasure so that my parents had the pleasure of not being upset or having me be too much.
Right.
So there's always, I have to kill my pleasure in order to maintain the connection so that they won't. So there's always this, who's going to have pleasure?
Yes, that's the truth, right? There's a lot of, like we were talking about, there's a lot of images about what it means to have pleasure. Am I going to get killed in it? Is someone else going to get killed in it? Am I going to be taking it away from someone? Am I going to be, shamed in it? There's all this worry. And so we stand outside of it and then long for it and are resentful that we don't have it. And yet the lecture says it's right there. It's not even there. It's here. It lives in you
Yeah.
already,
Yeah.
you know?
It's so interesting because I'm listening to you and thinking about it through a developmental frame. All of these things we're talking about, some version of them are actually necessary to learn how to regulate. So in a way, because if you don't have them, that doesn't go well either.
Right.
So in a way, you actually can't avoid some of the constriction it creates. And it's an interesting thing to ponder because how would you, I mean, it's almost like you have to be able to develop a coexisting self-awareness or some permission to revisit all of this. Because you can't actually grow up in an environment without these influences in a healthy way.
Right. In a healthy way.
Right. So it's like none of us could avoid some of this.
No,
Right.
and that's, none of us, I think, do avoid this.
Right.
What happens
Maybe,
is
yeah.
that what happens is that where it's all, where it becomes distortion and where it becomes a restriction of our flow and where it sort of gets us into destructive behavior and doesn't allow us to sort of fully be in our energy, we have to do the work to uncover, well, where is the distortion in all of this?
Yeah.
How is it being misused, right?
Sorry?
How is it being misused?
How
those
is it being
currents,
misused, right?
Yeah.
Because there is a truth that,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, that if you that you will lose. There's a truth of endings, right? But it's the belief about what that ending means that's in distortion that keeps you in the negative motivation, right? And it's the duality of, well, death is bad.
Yeah.
So therefore, if I have my pleasure and I'm going to lose, and losing is bad, then I'm going to spend all my time making sure I never lose. And meanwhile, pleasure is 60 miles away at this point. It's like, it's not reachable.
Total state of misery.
Right.
That's okay.
Often, yeah. Even if we're not conscious of it. We're so busy, we don't even know we're miserable.
That's another thing.
Yeah.
Lose touch with those feelings,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and there's a charge in being busy. Like, oh my God, I'm staving off death. This is amazing, right? It's like, but you could be living. It's like, what? You know, so and the way, you know, like every other lecture we read and we teach, you know, the way to do all of this is to first really uncover, which is what tonight's lecture was about, which is to just put on paper, you know, whatever, you know, what is pleasure? It's flow, it's joy, it's alignment, you know, it's sensation, it's feeling connected to our sort of inner wisdom, it's using our outer ego in service of that inner wisdom, and it's creating and being in pleasure. Okay, well, why do we block it? Well, we have belief systems about pleasure. I can't have it, I'm gonna get killed in it, it's gonna kill someone else, it's selfish, it's not spiritual, it's blah, 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 right? And then we realize that we also sort of, you know, get so entwined in terms of the negativity that we spend all our time staving off what might happen that we don't want to happen, that we lose our pleasure current in that process. And then we talked about dependency, where we're sort of waiting for someone else to give us permission to have pleasure. The unitive and dualistic consciousness, where it you know, as long as we're in duality, we're constantly going to be in negative motivation because we don't want that bad thing to happen to us. And then lastly, we talked about, you know, our demands and how, you know, sort of being unwilling to accept what is, forcing our energy onto other people because we're dependent on them to give us permission to have what we want, blocks our pleasure.
Or with demand, I feel like so many parents, like you were giving your example of your niece who's, I feel like this as a parent is like, if my son's acting out or whatever, that my ego is like, he has to learn that he can't do this for the, you know, and
Right.
it bothers me.
Right.
And then I go in on that and make demands like, you can't do
Right.
that, like you better, you know, it's not nice, or I would do it this way, or
Right.
whatever. And so I feel like the demand is also so much in service of the ego of like, I'm afraid he's gonna be a jerk in
Right.
the world, or people aren't gonna like him, or I'm
Right.
seen as a bad parent,
Right.
or whatever.
Right, and I think as you kind of do this work where you move from, not to say you're compulsive, but like where you move from that place where there's a lot of rigidity because of fear, you move closer to the center where you can say, yeah, there are things you do want to teach your son about containment. You don't want him to just, right? But you also don't want to take from him as an innate spirit.
Totally.
But you need to allow your innate spirit to come through before you can allow him to have it as well.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly. I think most of the parents are triggered because they block themselves so badly when they see it in a child. It pisses it off because they killed off this part of themselves long time
Yes.
ago. And so, you know, the children are putting mirror and then it drives you crazy. Like, how come he has
Totally.
this?
Yes.
Totally, it triggers you, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It triggers you.
Totally.
But I think, you know, like, it's a difference between healthy discipline and being triggered.
Totally.
And that's this, I think, center place where the healthy discipline is based on a strong ego strength about values and you know what is best for him in that way versus like you have to be this because if you're not this, you know, you will be everything I didn't want you to be and that'll be a reflection of me and it's like, whoa, that's so not who you are as a parent and you're stuck in that,
Right.
you know?
Right.
You know, we've talked about it, but you know, I would add certainly fear. I mean, it's embedded in all of this, but you know, our the fear of whatever happening if we're in pleasure. Like each one of us, if I were to go through, would probably have one specific thing that they, you know, again, my fear is if I really have my pleasure, I will be struck down. So the way that I manage it is to, I usually can feel where the edge is, and I'll let myself go that far, but I will never let myself go farther. And it's not a great experience. You know, it's like to know that I could go farther in pleasure, but I stop myself because I hold a belief and a fear that in that moment I'm going to get struck down.
But once you look at that belief, can you move it forward a little?
I hope so. I'm trying. I'm trying.
And I have a new theory that on the other end of the pleasure is God.
Uh-huh.
Like clit in a woman is connected straight to God. You know, like if you study Tantra,
Uh-huh.
sexual pleasure in the olden ages, that's another path to enlightenment.
Uh-huh.
It's a very legitimate path to God.
Uh-huh.
So this, what they did with it, you know, that's why people have all these sicknesses now and pornography, and then people are sexual addicts and all that, because it became outlawed by the churches and other institutions. But if you look at the like ancient India or all of these enlightened societies, sex was a path to enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And the bigger the sexual pleasure, you can have such an orgasm that you wake up on the other side in astral.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's what it's connected to really. So I don't think it's the fear necessarily of being struck down. I think it's the fear of being enlightened.
Okay, great. Yes, and the lectures say this, like we are equally afraid of not getting what we want as we are of getting what we want. Because if we get what we want, if we reach that enlightenment or have that pleasure, then what? Like, what am I going to have to do there? Like, can I hold it? What if I have to change my whole life because I realize that like that's the truth of who I am? So, you know, there is as much fear of pleasure as there is of pain. There's probably more fear of pleasure than there is of pain.
Probably, because that's connected to the God part.
Yeah, our power.
Connected straight to the
Yeah.
to the enlightenment.
Yes.
That's how I feel about it.
Yes.
That if you allow yourself fully to experience that pleasure, you'll see what's on the other side.
Yes.
That's scary.
Yes.
Do you think that ego serves a purpose? Like, I'm a recovered addict
Uh-huh.
right now, all drugs, and the program teaches a complete destruction of ego. So it's a program of ego deflation.
Yes.
So then, in the humility, pleasure comes from service and all these things that suddenly aren't the externals, which made you reach for the substance or whatever
Yes.
it is. So do you feel that the ego serves a purpose?
Absolutely. It's the overexertion and the over-reliance on the ego as the sole.
Right, or two egos.
Well, it depends what theory you're looking at, you know? I mean, it's like if you look at more, you know, Freud's idea of like ego, id, and superego, which kind of has elements of this diagram here, right? Where the ego is this kind of referee between kind of that moral, valued, kind of being the right person with our impulses. You want someone in between. You want someone kind of managing. You don't want id sort of, you know, all the time. And you don't want that sort of moralizing, you can't do anything, that judger. You don't want that. So the ego really referees between those two energies, right? So in that way, the ego is very necessary, right? If the ego is completely, I think what you're talking about is if the ego is totally in service of feeding something and not in service of being aligned with that sort of inner wisdom, our higher self, right? Then we're going to not use it well. And that was in that lecture talks about how addiction is a result of an overexerted ego. Because the ego is held so tightly that the only way, again, to liberate themselves from that tight hold is to act out, is to like literally liberate themselves from such a strong hold with alcohol or drugs. It sets them free. You know? So in that way, it's like, yeah, there's something really wrong with that structure of the ego in that person. It's too tightly held. It's too controlled. And so the idea would be, don't push it aside. You need it. It has a real purpose. Ego has a really wonderful, essential purpose for us to function and do really good things. It's that what's it in service of?
So you can have ego and humility at the same time.
Yes. That'd be a really cool person. Someone who has someone who has like the capacity to create in the world and to kind of maintain balance and boundaries, and also just, you know, and know themselves, but also recognize that like they're no better than anybody else. You know, and then they have things to offer that maybe others don't. I mean, yeah, I want to date someone like that.
And you know, coming back to the tight grip, I see a lot that the children who are brought up by parents who are very strict act out and usually go to addiction.
Yeah.
Because they were never let, you know, that pleasure of that higher self
Yes.
to express. They were just holding such a tight grip.
Yes.
The only way out of this prison is through, you know, something,
Yes.
drugs, alcohol,
Yes.
sexing, something where they can feel the flow
Yes.
and the pleasure for even in that older state.
Yes.
Because
And
they were called up.
yeah, and I would just want to qualify, I'm not trained in addictions, and so what I'm only speaking to is what this lecture says, which is that specifically in this lecture it talks about addiction as being kind of the only way out for someone who has such a hold. Their ego is so tight that their belief system about who they have to be or who they are is so tight that it's the only thing that liberates the ego.
Well, it's like I love when you're talking about moving into the fear feeling, you know, because the using is get me out of the now.
Yes, right.
Right, so move in. I have a teacher that just says sit with that,
Yes.
that pain that's beautiful.
Yes.
Feel it.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
Give it a name.
Yep.
You know, and just sit with it for
Yes.
30 minutes and just move into it.
Yep.
So I loved how you talk about that because I used my whole life to get out of the now.
Yeah.
So to move in and actually deal with problems for the first time without having to reach for a bag,
Yes.
or whatever it may be, right?
Yep.
And deal with that. Why are you in fear?
Yes.
Why do you have to validate that you have to make 2x what the next person makes?
Yes, that's right.
You know,
That's right.
and all that.
Yes. And you being able, the more we're able to we use the word in core contain, which is hold the feelings, like to be able to actually hold them in our physical body, the more we build our ego strength, true ego strength. No longer the ego of the I am Aimee and I'm the all power, I'm whatever. That's I don't know what that is. But the ego strength of like I can accept what is and feel my feelings about it and still stand here. Like that's ego strength. You know? And I think that's, you know, again, whether you're on the more compulsive side or you're on the more impulsive side, you know, we want to move towards this middle ground where real pleasure exists and a strong ego exists. Okay.
So, when I read the lecture, one of the things that jumped out at me was toward the end, it said something about it was almost compassionate toward this over tightly held ego, because we have these negative currents of energy and these negative belief systems, and that's the way we actually need an overbound ego in some places because we have such negative beliefs. Did you know what I'm talking about? Did you read that?
I read it, but I don't know if I. Yeah.
And I was just wondering if, you know, something about fear there, where there's so much fear in certain places in me
Mhm.
where I need that overbound ego because I have in specific places such a negative belief system that I
Mhm.
need that containment, that sort of not healthy containment, but that unhealthy containment until I can get a healthy,
Right.
build a healthy containment.
And as you know, like if you work through that layer of negative belief system, you're ultimately going to get to the higher self-truth.
Right.
And then your outer ego can work with that higher self-truth to create whatever you want.
Right.
Right? So it's about working through that negative belief system to help your ego kind of loosen its grip.
Mhm.
But I often, I often sort of this idea of that, in the t-shirt world, it's like, ego bad, and I just
Right.
want to say to them, ego not bad,
Right.
like,
Right.
ego necessary. I don't know why I'm talking like a caveman, but ego necessary. Like you have to have a healthy ego.
Yeah. Well, I think what the lecture was saying, now that you mention it, for me was not that you had to work through the ego and dismantle the ego, but that as you work down through that layers, as you were talking about, work through that process, you didn't need the ego anymore, and you could just let it go. You could just, there was more of just a releasing rather
Yeah.
than a sort of like ego bad, dismantle this,
Yes.
push that away,
Yes.
Sort of making the ego the villain.
Yes, and the lecture quite clearly says, channel that. Do not push the outer ego aside. Channel it towards awakening and activating the inner wisdom. And like that's the message, because in the inner wisdom is where the pleasure is. And so if you can take all that energy you're using to get people to approve of you, or to stave off death, or to make sure bad things don't happen, if you could take all that energy your ego's in service of now and channel it towards awakening and activating that inner wisdom, it's like life's going to be really different, and you're going to feel the pleasure more often, because that's where the pleasure lives.
And also, in certain lectures, the guy distinguishes between ego with the little e and ego with the capital
Uh-huh.
E. As that, when we separated from the Godhead, in those early lectures, about being a bubble in the ocean, and the bubble's coming up. Well, this is our evolution. Is that boundary of that bubble is the ego.
Uh-huh.
And so I see when I am very caught up with marrying and grappling with all this stuff in this material world, and it's overwhelming. I see that little e,
Mhm.
And then when it's like, oh, who's picking up the teacup? Spirit, of course. Who is opening the refrigerator? Oh, Spirit, of course.
Mhm.
I've shifted into the capital,
Mhm.
because it serves me to be here in this material world. And
Mhm.
that just these little things that we each have our own ways of handling
Yes.
things. That has always served me.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's pretty much related to everything that has just been said, but it seems, doesn't it, that the big fear here, the basic fear, is that the ego has is just that of letting go, and just like she mentioned, just that surrender, and that fear of letting go comes from lack of trust
Mhm.
that there is something
Mhm.
beyond this duality that the ego is experiencing, every day.
Mhm.
So the ego fears to let go,
Mhm.
basically let go of control,
Mhm.
because it lacks trust of what's going to be beyond,
Yes.
right?
And
And
the-
then the key seems to be then to just allow the ego to just surrender and just, and really deal with whatever it is that is blocking that,
Yes.
that surrendering. And
Yes.
just let it be.
And oftentimes, most times, we don't do it on our own, and so crisis presents itself, and then it forces us to do it, and then we see that we survive it, and then we have a choice in that moment after we've survived it to say, oh, my biggest fear was like my father death, and I somehow have survived this,
Yeah.
Painfully, and the work has been so hard, and the terror, but it's like, I'm building trust with myself by walking through it.
Yeah.
And by facing it each day. And so
So
but I wasn't going to do it before he died. I mean, I was fighting it,
So
right?
you're building a healthy ego,
I think I'm building a healthy ego for the
That-
first
that's
time in my
what it
life.
seems like, yeah.
Why? Because I'm accepting what is. I'm not staving it off. I'm not
Precisely.
making deals with God, saying, if you do this, this will happen. If I, it's like, and strangely, and I have to think about this before I say it, but I will. In my grief, I've actually been able to touch pleasure in a way I've never touched pleasure before.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Because you allow yourself to grieve.
because I am not denying anything, including pleasure. You know?
Just accepting reality.
Yes,
as it
just
is, yeah.
accepting as it is allows for like all this stuff to come up, you know? Even, and then you're like, well, you shouldn't have pleasure now, but it's like, why not?
Exactly.
Why not? In this place,
Pleasure
we
goes
shouldn't have
away.
pleasure now. But in the unitive state where like birth, life, and death is all a continuum, like why wouldn't, you know?
Yes, seems what
I
it
hear
is
you
practice.
saying you're touching life.
Yes.
Yeah, and so therefore you feel pleasure.
Yes.
Life is pleasure.
And yet, in my distorted thinking, touching life meant death, and I was going to do everything to avoid it. But as soon as I said, I have no choice here, my father's gone, I now have to look at death, it introduced me to life for the first time, which is introducing me to pleasure. You know? So
Because that was the bigger fear and you had to overcome it.
yeah. Yeah, and I haven't overcome it. I'm willing to meet it in a way that before I was like, no, I'm just going to do everything to believe that you don't even exist. Now it's like, okay, it's here. You know, what do I do with it? You
I
know?
have a question about this negative, because I'm kind of sort of new to Pathworks. So once you see those negative pictures blocking you,
Uh-huh.
what is really the work to do? You just observe them, like you were saying, sitting with the feeling, letting it pass, dig deeper, find out where they came from.
It's a process, and the emphasis on this tonight has really been about, it's a process of discovering first what are your belief systems around this? What is your negative motivation? The process of then working through that and discovering the feelings and transforming that energy into a more truth, sort of higher self, it's a full process. And every Pathwork lecture you read will sort of lay out what that process is. What I would say for you, since you're new to the work, and to really everyone, is that at this stage, just work on consciousness. Work on just sort of awakening to like just your belief system. You said something great today, which is love is conditional, right? And how obvious of an association that would have to your pleasure current. Because you need love and want love. But if it's conditional, then you're going to have to meet all those conditions, and that's where your energy is going to go. And you can't be in the pleasure current when you're busy over here making sure that you're loved and meeting the conditions, because you need that love, which might take you to this dependency place, you know? So the invitation is to just, I think, explore at this point the questions that are coming up for you in your mind.
I think it's very important to put things in writing too.
Yes.
It really helps a lot. It's hard to do and you want to resist doing it, but to put things in writing and ask for guidance and ask for, I want to know all my feelings right now and I want to understand what's my negativity about this. And then you don't really think the ego wants to stop the movement, but if you do that and then you write, I find that like it exactly lays out right what the deal is.
Yeah.
It's very helpful.
Yeah.
That's what they immediately was gonna say, right? That is.
I was gonna say in response to you that just being, working with people, especially young adults who, when they're healthy-ish, and they feel sad about something. And like I sat with somebody this week and she's like, I feel so sad about this thing and like, what do I do? And I'm like, well, you just feel sad, but here we are and I'm here with you and we just can feel sad and it's okay, it's normal. And I think so many kids and all of us growing up, like, sad is bad,
Right.
you want to escape. And maybe that seems obvious, but she's really desperate, like, what do I do? She really asks, what do I do now?
Feel it.
Yeah, just like
Right.
here. But when you open to that and you sit with it and you allow somebody to witness it and be there with you, to me, that's really is part of the flow.
Yes.
In that sadness, you feel heard, understood, contained, and it just in that sadness,
Yes.
there's nothing to do. But I think people think so much. Oh, there's something to do about
Yes.
this.
American culture is everybody's okay all the time.
Exactly.
But I think there are ways that on a very practical, like tomorrow or tonight, if you go out and have a meal tonight or tomorrow, like see what it's like to take pleasure in your meal. Like see what it's like to even just allow yourself pleasure in something, And if you don't allow it and it's really just about getting the meal over with or getting a conversation over with, or it's like, wow, I'm really denying myself an experience here. Why? Why would I do that when it's right here for me? And the more we model choosing to have the sadness or the pleasure, or the more, if we're in professions like yours, or if you, as a parent, or, you know, it's like the more the child or the client sees, like, oh, it's okay.
Exactly. Like, I will survive that.
Yeah.
I can be sad and cry,
Yes.
but it's not gonna last forever.
Yeah.
And I will survive.
Yes.
Well, no, I was gonna say there's a saying, comparison, death and happiness. So if you wanna feel shitty, go on Facebook. Because, sorry. Because, and I know people who are going through deep pain, and they put these pictures
Yeah.
of how amazing everything is, and I know that they're going through some very, very deep trauma,
Yeah.
right? And you know, they just, it's so important for them to show everyone that they're keeping
Okay.
up with the Joneses and they're doing great, when inside they're dying
Yes.
inside.
Yes.
You know?
And that goes back to, again, the attachment to the identity, right?
Yeah.
Because we have to show each other how much we're living up to our potential, right? Even though in reality, like, they're suffering. They're just in their humanness. They're not even doing anything wrong. They're just in their humanness, which is messy sometimes and painful. You
But
know?
that's how our own culture. We don't mourn in public anymore. We don't, like, it's just,
Yeah.
death is like closed off behind closed
Yes.
doors. It's like, you know,
Yes.
we don't mourn, we
Yes.
don't do anything. in
But I think the
public.
more that, you know, the whole idea of the pathwork is that, you know, our individual transformation lends to the collective evolution. And it's like, if we do this for ourselves, then we will mourn in public alone. And then other people will join us in that process, right? So there's a civic duty here for us as individuals to do. I beg you, because he wants the wall. So, I mean, there's a, you know, if we can show that our demands, that we don't have to get our demands met, that it's okay to cry if we don't get the wall. Like, it's okay. It's okay.
Right.
But, yes.
So, I mean, listening to you, it just seems like there's a whole culture of shortage around pleasure. You know, like, we have to put it underground, can't show it, you can't. I'm dependent on you to give me permission for my pleasure, and God forbid you have pleasure, because then you're supposed to ask me if you're supposed to have it. So we're all kind of locked down, sort of society in shortage around this.
Yes.
So it's like, to me, it seems like the first lock to spring is like this dependency lock. Of,
Yes.
like, I can mourn because I need to mourn.
Right.
And not because I don't want to
Yeah.
offend you, or I don't want to, like, give you the impression that I'm not functioning, you know, 100%, all 8 cylinders.
Yep.
And then, I don't know, there's even another layer beyond that. I mean, once I clear that hurdle, it seems like there's like this
Yep.
idea
Oh, there's layers.
that my pleasure is your pleasure.
Yes.
You know, and that you having pleasure gives me pleasure
Yes.
instead of makes me fearful. And makes
Yeah,
me,
and I think it was something that you said about enlightenment, which is, you know, if we were to really all have our pleasure, life would be really different, and we would be far more responsible for meeting our potential. And the guide says this, and I agree. I think we're lazy. I think we're too lazy to have pleasure sometimes, because pleasure comes with responsibility to, like, be in it and do with it. If pleasure is creativity and you're in your pleasure, then create. And if, you know, if I'm lazy, I'm like, I don't want the responsibility to create. So, I mean, it's a different take on this, right? I mean, we're focusing here more on, like, why we shouldn't be pleasure because it was made bad, you know. But it's like, let's also look at the place where we don't want to be big. Because why? Because I'm going to have to be responsible in that big place. I can't just rest on, you know, staying small.
Right. And that's sort of almost two different spheres. One is sort of, we're in this dependency, we're in the negative concepts, and once we clear a lot of that, then there's that other, there's that whole other arena.
Yeah. It's
right?
like, do we really want to be that big?
Yeah.
And when I ask myself that question, this feels manageable, because I get it. Like, I have beliefs and I know how to work through them, and and we can all work on it together, and we can go to support groups and talk about it, and it's all really good. But if at the end of the day the question is, like, do we all really want to be really big? Maybe everyone's going to be like, oh, I don't know, actually.
And then this becomes a good place to hide out.
Right. That's what I meant by the cop-out, like where guilt can be a cop. It's like, because it's like we do hide out here so that we don't have to feel pleasure, because there's something about pleasure that may challenge us in a way that where we're lazy and we don't want to do it. And that's not a judgment. It just means that we're lazy.
Mm-hmm.
But there might be some fear in that.
Oh, for sure.
The bigger
Yeah,
you are,
yeah.
the bigger target you are.
Yeah.
All of that, right.
Responsibility.
Yeah, yeah.
Self-responsibility is a big one, I think.
Yes.
You're have to be responsible
Yes.
for, managing this pleasure.
Yes.
And the scale.
Right.
A larger identity, with
Right.
within
That's why the guide says is like, we fear having it as much as we fear not having it.
And
You know?
there's a lot of responsibility in just feeling fear. Feeling that fear is, that takes effort, right?
Yes.
Too. You
Yes.
can't be lazy.
Yes, and I don't mean
Feeling
lazy
fear.
as, when I say lazy, I don't mean judgment. That word lazy is in a lot of these lectures, and it just means that our human self doesn't realize the strength of our spiritual self. And so the human's like, I can't do that, when we can. We can. So it's not like it's just like, I don't feel like going out and getting coffee. It's not that kind of laziness, although I don't. Okay, so we did a lot tonight. I hope it felt somewhat coherent in a way that has you thinking about pleasure in a different way, or a deeper way, or a more nuanced way. And I'm hopeful that some of these things on this list will become something that you do in your own practice in terms of exploring pleasure with yourself, with your clients, with different audiences. And if you have any questions that come up about the lecture, you could feel free to reach out and we could talk about more. But before we close, are there any other just final comments or questions that people have?
Yes, I'm the original hardworking Midwestern girl. In New York, who became a single mom and all kinds of stuff, really hard worker. And so this has been on my agenda like for decades. And so I guess it was last year sometime someone in one of my support groups said something, you need to have more fun. And I looked grim and I thought, oh,
Another job.
I thought, okay, because I have a lot of interest and highly creative line of interest, but I realized that none of it felt like fun. And it's the fun that is attached to pleasure, not
Yes.
just ha-ha.
Yeah.
Fun,
Yeah.
pleasure. So I knew that at this time of my life, I needed to turn that over to God. And so I just created, I'm into powerful questions, bring powerful answers.
Mhm.
So I turned it over, with a powerful question, wrote it down, dated it, what is fun for me now?
Great.
So I won't go into what happened, but one of the most extraordinary things happened. At the time it happened, I went with the flow. I didn't know that was the answer until I got home that night and sat on my visit. I had fun! Because when I was in it, I was in the flow.
Yes.
I wasn't saying, oh, I'm having
Yes.
fun. I was in it, experiencing the expanded state.
Yes.
And it just still brings some tears to my eyes because I'm, need to be practicing that.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And I think I just want to just to that point just kind of really go back to this chart we built about this kind of the ego strength and the pleasure together, like to have the flow without becoming sort of like so scattered and so ungrounded, and to have pleasure without sort of needing to box ourselves into a very rigid way. And so it's really moving towards the center space where there's flow, but there's also containment as a result of a strong ego. That, to me, again, it's kind of like you were saying, ego and humility. Like, you add humility here, I would definitely date this guy. We add all three of these, yeah. So, yeah, just to think about that. That sort of, we want, what direction do each of us need to move away from into this state of, flow with its strong ego in service of that inner wisdom, with humility. That'd be a cool culture to be a part of. Yeah. Thank you.